Hi, I'm Joe Park, CEO of Horizon Stewardship. Welcome to today's webinar, Money in Ministry. Today, we're going to be focusing on budgeting, annual giving, and financial management. I'm thrilled to have with me today Stan Reiff. Stan is a partner at CapinCrouse Ministry. Also with him is Ken Tan, a partner who has actually been teaching this in 9 different cities for one of the major denominations in the United States. Let's begin with the importance of a 12-month ministry funding plan. Ministry funding plan is another word for budget. It's one that makes it sound like you're doing ministry instead of paying the light bill. So we encourage when you face those words outwardly that you use ministry funding plan, ministry spending plan, ministry impact plan, ministry budget, if you just must have that word. But whatever you call it, Stan, talk to us a little bit about its importance and the creation.
So Joe, let me just go ahead and jump in on that. Certainly also being clergy, I'm an ordained minister, so I could quickly get up on my soapbox behind the pulpit and preach on what you just said. The reality is, we have a lot of scripture on you don't set out to build a building without first understanding the cost. You don't wage war without understanding what it takes. There's just so much involved with planning. And certainly we know that God is the God of order and creation and creativity. So with that, so many times I've observed, both having been in a ministry setting, having served in a church as well as ministries, where it's really easy for us to really, okay, it's budget time, that bad word, and we sit down, we do a budget, then we put it on the shelf, we don't worry about it. And then we come over here and do the exciting things around strategic planning and ministry impact, and somehow they don't match. And so we really are advocating that you really need to do your strategic plan, your ministry plan, and figure out what it's going to cost, and then put the money together with that. And now every time you're talking about your ministry plan, you've got your financial resources aligned so you can have a greater impact. And you suddenly realize, wow, we're spending money on something that's not part of the plan. So it must not be as strategic. So that even as you're saying, paying the light bill becomes strategic. If the lights aren't on, we can't have congregational worship in our building.
Let me just sidebar question on that. Most churches 10 years ago were using calendar periods. They'd begin in January and they'd run through December. But for most churches, that doesn't align with the ministry spending plan, which generally begins in the fall and runs through the calendar year. I have seen among our clients a big shift, maybe as much as a third of staff-led churches that have already shifted to a fiscal year other than a calendar year. Do you have thoughts on that? Recommendations, best practices?
Two things that we're seeing, which is consistent with the annual budget, if you or the annual ministry spending plan, is doing it on the 90-day basis. But the reason for that is, if you think specifically within the church world, we have our fall programming. Then we come up with, the whole Christmas activities. Then we kind of start into January getting fresh with new classes, new small groups, new topics, kind of culminating towards the end with Easter, year-end graduations, and the promotions to the next grade. And then the summers usually allow your summer camps for your student ministries, whether it's local day camps with a elementary, or you're sending your youth away, overnight camps. These all tend to kind of be wrapped up in 90-day windows. And so we highly suggest kind of build your budget around those activities and then start it at a meaningful time. So Joe, you are correct. We are seeing more and more churches adopt an early fall, late summer. We are seeing a lot of others kind of picking it up on a June 30, July 1. So we would recommend evaluate the business process, the ministry flow of your church, and then adopt your ministry cycle. And we would say stay within kind of those quarters that are the traditional ones, such as, first quarter be January, February, March, so end on March 31, June 30, or September 30 or 12/31. The other thing that's really important to remember, and this is certainly true for churches as it is for many not-for-profits, is 12/31 year end is a big time for giving because of the tax implications for donors on an individual basis. If you're trying to budget for January 1 and you have no idea what your 12/31 numbers were, it's kind of hard to have a realistic budget because you're setting that normally 90 days before that funding event that really affects churches for the year. So again, that's another reason why a lot of ministries and churches are moving towards one of the other off-cycle periods, such as March 31, June 30 in particular.
Regardless of how you, what calendar you choose to use, you've recommended building it on a 90-day basis. How about evaluating it? Once you set it, you've taken your 4 quarters and you put them together, you built it. What about going back and looking at where you are? If you're just something's happened, you're completely off what your budget is, should you just let it roll or make adjustments?
I'll quickly just jump in and say the reason you want a 90-day evaluation, and technically you want to do it on a monthly basis, and then on a quarterly basis, you're looking for the trends for that quarter, because one variation doesn't make a trend. But when that 90-day window allows you to early detect if you need to make major changes or small tweaks. So you've got plenty of time ahead of you to make these small tunings, these adjustments before they become major, because the further you go, the harder it is to recover what you didn't achieve in the previous period. So that's why you really want to, hone in on that with the anticipation on a quarterly basis. As a church leadership team, you're going to evaluate not just the financial budget, but the ministry impact. Is what we're doing effective? Did we get the results we were looking for, whether it was increased attendance, whether it was increased engagement, whether it was increased community awareness? There's so many different things to measure based on your objectives. The finances are only a part of it, but they're an important part, but not in a vacuum or in isolation. Ken, are you seeing anything differently in the last several weeks when you've been out on the road traveling?
It's actually interesting you mentioned that. I think as I started talking to a lot of churches after these financial seminars, especially when we start talking about even budgeting and stewardship, the concept of a lot of them starting to be proactive about doing these 90-day evaluations have become more frequent. And, I think one of the things I would like to mention, if anything, is, the results of 2020 and 2021 have really shaped the way church leaders and those that are in committees, those that are actively involved, to have these conversations. Just because, as we know, and even just as a part of this year, there's a lot of things that are very, I would say they definitely are not as status quo as many people would assume or anticipate. And so really what ends up happening, and this is where one of the conversations I have had with church leaders has been, the use of your budget. There's really going to be no value if you're only going to look at it once a year, especially because many times as a congregation, you may only hear about it when it's presented, but there is a lot more value when we have these discussions, this dialogue, especially on this 90-day period. One of the things then as a part of this, and this is where I think, Stan, you've definitely put on the point, is it allows us to get a bearing for where we are towards what we were also envisioning and also planning for ahead. Because part of this, and this is where some of the terms we call agile, is you have to be very agile now in terms of how we lead and run a church. And that's also the same case in how we evaluate our finances as well.
Well, we don't want to lose that skill set or the agility as Ken was talking about, because guess what's happened in the first quarter this year? We now have inflation, different than the pandemic, but it's a new irregularity, even though we know inflation comes. If you're involved in finance at all, you're aware of the cycles that come and go. But, with the, how does that affect your giving at your congregation post-pandemic? How does it affect your staffing and the salary increases that people are looking for? As a financial leader, you're going to have to be very in tune to what's going on in your community, specifically in your church, as well as working with peers. How are you resolving this? What are you seeing? And Joe, you do such a great job with these webinars of keeping the Horizon Stewardship members and attendees informed of best practices. So certainly I applaud what you are doing with your team on this topic.
On that issue of inflation, if you haven't been paying attention, I wrote a blog last week that you can get at horizons.net dealing with the impact of inflation. But we saw both in March and April annualized inflation running at 8%. So one of the things you need over 8%. So if that holds, then just for you to maintain your ministry purchasing power at zero, you're going to have to, on average, increase your giving by 8% year over year, which is something that is going to require a fairly specific and intentional purpose. You're going to have to grow it by double digits if you're actually growing your ministry budget. Some of the other things that I see that have happened in the past that we really don't see or recommend churches doing. Back in the day, churches would take their income that they believe they were going to get and they would divide it by 12 and they would make a budget. They would take their expenses and divide it by 12. That's not very practical or useful and really a bit foolish today with computers who can really aid us in this process. What are some of the recommendations that CapinCrouse uses in regard to allocating income expense in a way that is reflective of how it comes in?
I can start this off, and Stan, you can build onto this. One of the things, especially as a part of what our roles are, Stan and I, we end up consulting and doing a lot where we end up being similar to like the CFO or the strategic advisor when we're going through the budgets. One of the things we want to make sure that we start looking at, of course, are those trends and using those trends as a way to even factor how we also look at our budget. So let's say, for example, let's just say a typical church. We know that typically giving will begin to be fairly high towards that end of the year as people start to consider donations. Typically, you may see a little bit of an uptick too as well around that Easter timeframe, but then it also slows down over the summer. As people start to take vacations, people are not there. Also, of course, just overall activity is focused elsewhere. We need to make sure that we see that, but then also add some assumptions to this. We know that, of course, how we do that then in our budgets means that how we're going to allocate our revenues and expenses needs to also reflect that those hills and valleys as a part of our function.
Drill in a little bit deeper, Joe, if that's okay. Let me give you some really, really practical insights that are things that Ken and I have used as actual tools in working with ministries and churches. And it's really simple, where you take the previous 3 years' income by month, and now you know what the total income for that year was, fiscal year, whether it was a calendar or otherwise. And then you start plotting and you do the ratio of 3 years ago, how much of our total income came in January? Of our total income, how much came in February? Now I have a percentage of the 100% for 3 years. When you plot that, you'll find a high year, a low year, and the one in the middle. And then you can also average those if there's not a strong correlation to now have that fourth one. Then when you actually say, here's what our new budget for the new year is, you take those ratios and apply it, and it will tell you what you should anticipate getting on a monthly basis. Then, certainly another topic within budgeting is just cash flow management. And we talk about how many months reserves you need. There's a standard of 3 months, but there's some other metrics you can look at that say, what are the biggest troughs? How many do we have in a row? Add those deficits for those months together. And you better have that much cash available between the last surplus line and the next one, as you're trying to make sure you have enough cash to get from this surplus to 2 or 3, 4 months ahead with the next surplus. You need to have that much cash available.
Ken, one of the things that, and Stan, that I have seen churches moving to, because information is so easily available in your computer systems, is actually keeping up with income by week, and then you can compare that. And when you do that, it will account for fifth Sunday months. It allows you to move Easter around, and that's one other way you can refine your budget. Those of you that are more complicated, using a rolling average, so it's 50% of the last year and 30% weighting. So just more advanced techniques if you're in a place to do that. But one of the challenges that I've seen is that churches have the technology with their CHMS systems and their accounting systems, but frequently the operators don't realize the capacity. And so a church treasurer or someone in accounting will say, we can't do that. And the reality is, most systems are able to provide that kind of information. There really is not double working. You put it in there and you simply define the period of time that you want to look at, whether that's a week, a month, a year. And so many churches get scared off, or finance committees get scared off because they believe that they can't do it. And it's very, very rare that a church doesn't actually have the technology to do that, unless you're, worshiping maybe under 50, and even if you're on QuickBooks, you can do it on QuickBooks. So just want us to point that out, and then let's transition into technology. There's a lot that is changing. You talked about recurring giving. Again, we believe that any church that puts much effort into that can get above 50%. And when we have clients that are very intentional, that are getting over 90% through recurring giving, what else do you see shifting in the technology world that is impacting churches today?
We're starting to see a lot of the churches that are growing. As we start to talk to them, they are ones that are very data minded in terms of understanding what the information they're getting out of these systems and how they are using it. And so when it comes to tools, Joe, we're seeing a lot more of not just the accounting system you're saying there, we're also seeing a lot of the churches doing more sophisticated types of data analysis. And as a result, they are able to use this in a way of slicing and dicing in a way that typically you might not have seen from a normal, let's say, an Excel workbook or so forth. There's nothing wrong with Excel. I just want to at least mention that as an accountant, we love Excel. And it has been a very valuable tool, especially as a part of allowing us to really get these computations in a way that's a lot more efficient than before, when it's manually using a 10 key or so forth. But one of the things, again, as a part of this, we're seeing a lot more tools being done to streamline a lot of the processes. It's also allowing a lot lower in terms of minimizing the risk of user error, but it is also a way where other folks, even outside of the finance side, are getting a better understanding of where their budgets are. And one of the things, and this is just a quick example, a lot of times in previous times, a lot of the department heads and ministry leaders would have to go straight to the accountant or the controller to say, hey, how am I doing? A lot of the new systems and tools now are allowing it where, of course, it is read-only access, but there's a way that a lot of leaders now, with some of these online type platforms, they're able to go in and see real live data as to what are their actuals versus their budgets. They're already starting to see some dashboards as well. And these are folks that are then, again, this is where we're talking about the agile side. People are then starting to have a lot more awareness as to where they are from a live perspective. And that's very important for us. I don't know if that's something you've seen as well, Stan, but that's some of the stuff that we started seeing with a lot of these growing churches, has been that need and craving for data and using the technology as a tool for that.
Spot on, Ken. I would say to that, there's going to be at least one or two people listening in right now saying, yeah, we don't have money to hire that kind of a person, and I don't have time to do that. So let's rewind a little bit and get to that position. One of the things we're seeing a lot of churches are moving towards, certainly the pandemic accelerated, it forced us forward 20 years. And that's where we not only want to automate our contributions coming in, but we're now going with digital and automated payments as well. So again, we've talked multiple times, Joe, about your utilities, having those automatically drafted, because then they are going to show up in your general ledger. They will show up in all your reports. If it's wrong, you'll know it. You'll see it when it happens. But you don't have to take time to do the data entry because it automatically is paid and it's automatically goes into your general ledger as well. Software such as Bill.com or sometimes your bank cash management systems will allow you to do your online bank transactions through an EFT, so you don't have to write paper checks and chase people around to get signatures. It's amazing. We work with enough organizations where, again, obviously a little bit larger size, but we can save 20 to 40 hours a month in just total labor costs of just pushing paper around. That does not add value when you think of having to print it, file it, fold it, copy it, stuff it in an envelope, lick it, put a stamp on it, walk it to the mailbox. Those kinds of things don't add value to making anything get paid. If we get all those resolved and get it automated, just like we are on the income side, now we've got time without extra money to do these analytics that Ken's talking about and doing the graphical representation, or what we call the visualization of the data, so that the non-accountants, the non-number people, clearly see in color and shapes, whether it's gas gauges or red light, green light, yellow light. It helps them really understand where they're at. And certainly it's very, very helpful for the church leadership, elders, deacons, and others on the maybe the finance trustee committee.
Let's shift to measuring. You mentioned return on investment, these 90-day periods, meaning are we having the ministry impact we want, and being willing to make adjustments based on that. You also mentioned in a previous email that the importance of measuring more than just dollars. There are other indicators of health. There are other connections between, say, someone's giving and their engagement in your discipleship path. So what are you seeing new, interesting, and important about that?
So I'm actually, Joan, again, you and I have talked about this multiple times. Certainly, post-COVID, attendance is not necessarily a good number to look at anymore. Engagement has become a more important number. But I think some of the things that are emerging right now, as we're looking strategically at, in many ways, rebuilding the new church moving forward, what does this look like? And some of the subconscious or unspoken impact of the pandemic on marriages, depression, relationships, etc. The youth, it's amazing how many the studies are of how many early elementary kids are entering school, first grade, and never had a classroom experience, if you will. Those kinds of things. So within the church environment, I'll just do a couple of composites. Churches are saying, you know what, we're aware that marriages have really, really taken it on the chin the last couple of years. We're going to invest to strengthen marriages in our congregation. We're going to invest X amount of dollars, and we want to affect X amount of families. Okay, so the end result is not how many families were cured or did not end in divorce, or no. It's as simple as a KPI as how many couples actually attended. So we put on the event, we had a speaker, we had all this money budgeted, but nobody came. That's a really expensive event with no impact. So now what do we need to do different? Was it the wrong night? Was it the wrong topic? We want to evaluate and then try again. So that's one example. It may be we need to impact more youth, either the existing youth in our congregation and get them back together, or we need to really impact the youth in our local high schools close to our church. Well, how do we do that? How do we get high school students who have not been attending church? What do we need to do differently? How much will that cost? We spend the money, and did we get some unchurched youth to attend our activities? Those become really simple KPIs, KRAs, key result areas, key performance indicators, leading indicators of what we hope to do once we start this activity, recognizing certainly in the church world and a faith community, we can't always measure the spiritual impact as much as we would like. Sometimes it's obscure. We don't know how many divorces would have occurred had we not done something, but we still know that families are healthier from these open dialogues and marriage seminars. Those are just a couple of examples of having a strategic mindset towards the community. Maybe we want to, we know that there's homelessness or there's a lot of poverty and hunger in our community that we want to impact. So we want to do something in our church that we can contribute X amount of pounds or a truckload or whatever the measurement is of groceries and dry goods to give to the local food pantry. We measure it that way, knowing that that kind of impact will translate to X amount of boxes to serve X amount of families. How much are we going to invest in communication and energy and or contribute from the church budget as part of a collective church effort to encourage our church members to be part of the community facing we are for our community? Those are just some examples of strategic community engagement, putting money beside it, and then measuring, did we accomplish the goal?
And that's really important when it comes to the giving side of it. Essentially, from baby boomers on down, with each passing generation, they become more and more sensitive to impact. So when you measure, you can tell stories of impact. When you measure your discipleship path, we know that givers who are actively engaged in worship give more than those that aren't. If you can get someone actively engaged in a small group or actively engaged in hands-on ministry, they give you about 3 times more than someone who just comes to worship twice a month. So when you're budgeting, think about the impact that it is producing for your ministry purposes. You can also, don't forget about the discipleship path, because what you invest in small group, Sunday school development, getting people actively involved in ministries will actually create a much better financial return as people's spiritual engagement moves along with their pocketbook is in response to their relationship to Christ. The more deeply involved they are. We're getting very close to the end of our time. Why don't you guys close us by talking about the risk of inaction? Then we'll move to any questions that folks have.
Sure. I guess I can finish that part up, and Stan, you can add to this. As I was just thinking about that too, when Stan was talking about even just non-financial metrics, a lot of times we start seeing some churches that end up going a downward trend. There is in itself that own pattern of complacency. A lot of times churches will end up just kind of keeping it status quo, not even thinking about some of the things that are impacting them. And sometimes they've accepted the fate that they will eventually have to have the conversation of closing it. We want our churches to be very active and proactive about thinking about their environment. Because I'm trying to say this at least as quickly as possible. There's some 3 additional things I think about, especially when I've talked to churches during my seminars, and a lot of them are ones that have come visited from rural cities and towns. And they've also had to start thinking about geographically where the concentration of members are now, because engagement, of course, is very key. They're starting to see some young families moving back because now with the workforce and the economy, people are able to work remotely. They've had to be mindful about that even though you're working remotely, people ultimately do crave community and relationships. Then we also factor in generational, just like you were saying there, Joe. There's going to be what you call, there's another term that'll probably be catchy later on called the great wealth transfer, in which over the next 10 years or so, from the baby boomers and the greatest generation, there'll be trillions of dollars that will be transferred to millennials and the younger generations. And so as churches, just as you're saying, that we have to be very mindful about how each of these generations have a different approach and perspective, that if we are not thinking about that and evaluating it as a part of our own church vision on engagement and outreach, we ourselves will be exposing yourself to the risk that we will also start to show decline. And so if there's anything that I want to just encourage the church leaders here that are attending, I want to say it's very important for us to have just that dialogue. It may be a very difficult conversation to talk about the what ifs, but I think it allows you to be one step ahead of many other churches because you're starting to understand what your environment is and what are some of the steps to be considered. Stan, what are some of your thoughts and takeaways?
So, Joe, certainly what Horizon Stewardship does around generosity is key. And I know central to your work is without vision, people perish. Without vision, the church declines. And so that's really key. If where are we going, what's God called us to do? That becomes the rallying point for people to be generous and give towards accomplishing that mission. What we're talking about is the accountability that goes with that. Because if we're going to make a difference, we need to understand what is it we're going to do? How are we going to measure that? And by the way, Ken, you have great insights. I totally even missed the piece of what's going on, and you experienced it in rural America, if you will, of the professionals who now can work remotely are moving back closer to family. But my biggest fear when I do my seminars with churches is if we're not engaged in the community around us, and we have become so internally focused around what kind of flavor of coffee are we gonna have for ourselves, the proverbial what color carpet do we want? Can we have preferred parking for whatever subset of our congregation instead of what does a community around us need? The inevitable is that risk of not doing anything for the community results in a death spiral that eventually there's not a congregation left with enough resources to make a difference. The church will close, and we've seen too many of this happening in the last 2 years. And ultimately, the biggest heartbreak is after you have closed, how long will it take before the community realizes you're no longer there? Do they even miss you?
Well, that's a dark note to end on, but really an important one. I think the takeaway is we are not in a season where we can continue to do blindly what used to work in the past. At some point, for what used to work in the past, somebody took a risk and created something innovative. And those same people who created that probably wouldn't want us still doing it 50 years later. They would think, oh my goodness, why didn't you adapt? And that is, if COVID taught us anything, it is we need to adapt. We're not going back to a previous time. Stan, Ken, thank you so much for being a part of this today. Our contact information is up on the screen. You can contact either CapinCrouse or Horizon Stewardship with any questions that you have. If you're looking for resources, we would be happy to provide those to you. Looking forward to our next webinar in this series, and everyone who's been with us today, blessings.